So if you think about life, it has a sort of very qualitative element to it. In other words, it's kind of difficult really to reduce everything down to numbers. So probably the easiest way to talk about this is to give you an example. So if I was to say, how happy are you? You might say, well, I'm really happy at the moment, and you might give me reasons why you're happy. You've got a wonderful okay, so I'll do that bit again. So you might say, I'm really happy at the moment because I've got a great boyfriend or girlfriend, or got a great family life. Right, I'm going to try and get past this guy. Afternoon. You're alright, don't worry. No, you're right. Okay, so qualitative. Yeah, so qualitative studies are really trying to get to the deeper sort of essence of life, I suppose. So let's take an example. So happiness is a good example of this. So if you're going to do a survey, let's say, which is trying to understand happiness, you might have a survey that says, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy do you feel? It may ask you other questions to try and find correlations between, other things that are similar or that might give you happiness. So that's a very typical quantitative way of looking at it. But at the bottom of it, you might always think to yourself, after doing that sort of exercise, it just doesn't somehow capture the true nature of happiness. To try and put a number on it is kind of, it's just very difficult to make sure that you can make that meaningful in any way. So qualitative studies basically say, well, do you know what, we're not really going to try and reduce it down to a number. We're just going to try to describe what happiness is. We're just going to think about, what does it mean to be happy? How does that make me feel? How could I describe that? How could somebody else describe it? How could you talk about it? What is that experience about being happy? So a lot of this stems from a phenomenological approach, which is really just saying, what's it like for that person? So you're really trying to understand that in a very deep way. So that's qualitative studies, and there's a number of different methods that you can use for qualitative research. And there's one that I'm going to talk about in a lot more detail on another ride, because I'm currently doing some research that's qualitative. I'm going to talk about that research later. But the method I'm using is called Interpretative Phenomenological analysis. So that's probably the biggest mouthful of a method you can imagine. So I don't say it very often. Most people just call it IPA, which is easy to remember because it's like the beer. So IPA is a type of qualitative research. You generally, not always, but you generally interview somebody using what's called a semi-structured interview, which means you've got some questions that you want to ask, but if the person goes off piste, you're not going to stop them necessarily, or you might even notice something that's really interesting that you want to look at more. So that's a semi-structured interview, and on the basis of that, you then want to record the interview and you do some analysis of it, which is kind of like thematic analysis, in that you're looking for themes, you're looking for concepts, structures that they might have come up with, or constructs. And then what's interesting to me is, rather than it just being journalism, which it could be, at this point there's not much difference between that and journalism. But now what you have to do is you analyse the way that person has made sense out of that thing using psychological theory. So there's lots of psychological theory, things like attachment theory or identity theory, goal setting theory. All of these are pre-existing theoretical structures that you can now draw on. You can say, right, if I wanted to apply an identity theory in this situation, what can I say about the way the person talks about their identity in this situation? So some interesting studies that have been done are around, well, one was about pregnancy and going back to work. Jonathan Smith is the guy that's really developed this, and then there's some early adopters that use it as well. It's a method that was developed in the UK, actually at the university that I am doing my masters, so clearly there's a kind of interest within the university about that. So IPA is a way to get a really deep understanding. So there's a few phrases that are often used in it. I've used one already, which is this sense making. So IPA basically says that human beings are sense making machines. So we create a narrative around what's happening. We try to make sense of it through narrative, perhaps through story, and we frame it. So we frame what's going on in a very specific way. So that's why things are never purely objective, if you like, because we are the one framing what we're seeing. So when I see a piece of behaviour by somebody, I immediately frame that in some way. So one of the videos I've talked about hoarding behaviour. So when you see somebody buying enough toilet paper to last them for 6 months, you're framing that behaviour in a certain way. So you might be seeing them as selfish. You think that tells you something about that person. You may be right, you may not be. That's just what we do. So we're sense-making machines. We see things, we observe things, and then we try to make sense out of it. And we can only do that from the perspective of us. So that's why it's subjective, because even though what's happening is out there, it is real, the way that we interpret it, the way that we make sense of it, is ours. So that's IPA, Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis. So I'm going to be doing some research using that method on adults who left a new religious movement over 10 years ago, and the new religious movement was one that strongly discouraged things like further education, career, and you can imagine that once somebody's left an organisation like that trying to find a career is quite difficult. You might not even know how to begin, or you might not even have an understanding of what career means. So it's a really interesting area. I'm fascinated by it, and I'm particularly interested in it because I grew up in one of those new religious movements called the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I was about 30 when I left. I left school at 16, ended up window cleaning and going from house to house, knocking on doors, trying to convert people. So that was my job. And then when I left the organisation at 30, I didn't have many qualifications, just a few O-levels from secondary school, and nothing. So I'm really interested in the subject, and there's not just me, so I'm interviewing people who've been through that experience. And what's interesting and useful about IPA is, unlike a scientific approach that says, well, actually I couldn't do that research because I'm too close to it, it doesn't in a way matter, because it acknowledges that the person is always part of the analysis. So let's say I wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, or hadn't been a Jehovah's Witness, I'd been an atheist all my life. Well, I would still be looking at that, the interview, the person's interview, from that perspective, and I can't really avoid that, no matter how much I might try to be objective. So this allows me to do some research about an area that I'm fascinated by, firstly, and secondly, that means a lot to me. It's very important to me. But the research isn't to criticise Jehovah's Witnesses really, or to slag them off. It's just to, what's it like to go through that process of leaving and then find a career afterwards. Okay, so what I'm doing now, I'm going over it's called the Whistling Bridge. It was designed by somebody, I think semi-famous, but the idea is that when it's windy, the bridge whistles. It's basically just the wind whistling through, but it's been built to do that. So it's called the Whistling Bridge, and it's over the Nene here. So where I am now is often called Whittlesea Bank. So again, if I keep going up there, I'll go to Whittlesea. And yeah, it's a nice place. It's quite quiet. Not much going on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back along the Nene, but in the other direction. And I'm not sure, it might get quite windy, because I have a feeling the wind's been behind me, which is why I've enjoyed it so much. That's always one of the problems when you go on your bike and the wind's behind you, is you feel so good, it feels so easy. But before you know it, you've gone miles, and then of course you've got to get back. And the wind's against you. So you have to be careful of that.